All right. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. It's exactly 3:30. Thank you for coming to our session today. Prepare to succeed, the key to successful folio implementation projects. I am here with my two teammates, Robert and Brooks. We're going to introduce ourselves first. I have been a librarian for about 20 years. I specialize in cataloging. I used to work for a very small company that did very big projects. If you had 300,000 serials to move into an offsite storage, we were the people to call. We did small boutique cataloging projects, retrospective conversions. So doing project management there has almost prepared me for folio. So I'm really happy to be here. See all your faces.
I'm Robert Heaton. Heather and I both have the same job at EBSCO, managing implementation projects. And my background's e-resources, the whole life cycle around that, licensing and acquisitions and discovery, as well as collection assessment, collection development. Spent about 10 years at Utah State University before joining EBSCO. And a very brief career before that with translation project management that's kind of come back to me to tie into what I do now.
And okay. I'm Brooks Travis. I I have about 20 years of experience in general higher education IT. The last 6 years of that was spent as the IT coordinator for Missouri State University Libraries, where I was the project lead on the library side for the first implementation of Folio in North America back in spring of 2020. I also serve as a product owner, have served as a product owner in the Folio community for requests and the InReach integration implementation, and I'm also a member of the product council. I'm very engaged in the Folio project and community, and this is kind of what I love to talk about. So here we go.
All right, so we've already done our introductions. Today we're going to sort of break up the session into a few different general areas. I will talk about data migration and then turn things over to Robert, who will go over workflows and settings and integrations. And then we'll hand it over to Brooks to talk about how to form your local implementation team. So these are the phases of your folio implementation. When it comes to data migration, I think the first thing that you need to think about is, what do we consider data? We have two different types of data in folio. We have your reference data, which is going to be your settings. So everything that you need to consider in terms of your material types, your order settings, your marked instance mapping, all of that is going to be sort of your reference data, and that's what we're going to refer to that as today. You then have your regular data, which is the data that you are actually going to migrate from your legacy system into folio. So the process that we have at EBSCO is an iterative process. We are going to ask for your data. We will load that data. We will have you take a look at your data, and we expect you at this point to make some changes. The whole point of this being an iterative process is that we want to make it as clear of a picture of your library as possible. So this cycle is going to repeat itself. Once you refine your settings and what you want your data to look like to your librarians, we will then ask you for another extraction of data, and we'll go through that process again. And we find this to be incredibly helpful, which is why we approach projects like this on our team, because you're going to need to make tweaks. You're going to realize a couple months down the road, oh, I should have included this field in my mark to instance mapping. I should have included this finance setting, etc. One of the things we really recommend is to have favorite records that you keep track of as you iterate. So keep track of records from different parts of your library. Have your favorite records, and with each iteration, revisit those records to make sure that they look the way you want them to. So I would recommend have things from different parts of your library. Have a government document bibliographic record. Have something from special collections. Have some really complicated serials with some title changes. We really want to mess up your data and make sure that it looks right in the end. So that is one of our biggest pieces of advice as you move through this process. But as you move through this process, make sure you are keeping track of your mappings, because your mappings will likely change. So communicate with the person who is managing your data on the folio end to make sure that if you add or subtract locations, for instance, that has been accommodated in your mappings. It's time to talk about pitfalls. So data migration is going to come with pitfalls. This is going to be inevitable, but our job is to make this as painless as possible for you. Brooks is going to talk about putting together sort of the perfect implementation team, which requires a lot of time. You are going to likely be constrained by the length of your project and by the timing of each of your different data iterations. So be aware of that when you're going into this migration, that you are going to need to have people with the bandwidth to take on examining your data in depth. Another pitfall can be lack of systems access, being able to get your data out of your legacy system. You really need people, and preferably more than one person, who knows how to get reports, knows how to get bibliographic data, your items, your orders out of your legacy system. And depending on what system you're migrating from, that can be a larger task than other systems. It could be that while you are migrating, you have a lot of other projects going on. Maybe you are undergoing a weeding project. Maybe you are reclassifying one of your collections. Make sure that you allow bandwidth with your staff to be able to manage multiple projects at the same time and really understand the time commitment that any data migration is going to take. Also, keep those lines of communication open. I think it's really important to make sure that you're committed to weekly or bi-weekly meetings with the people who are on the hosting side of your folio. We generally meet at least once a week. Sometimes it's more than that. Keep the lines of communication open and be very clear about your expectations and what you really need from the folio system. So.
All right. I want to talk about setting up your workflows next, with kind of an explanation that we've organized it into phases to talk about it, but they certainly overlap and iterate with each other. I think it'll become clear how that works, and you're probably familiar with that from any number of systems anyway. As you gain knowledge of how Folio works, that informs how you set up your workflows, which how you determines how you set up your settings and that kind of thing. So I'm defining workflows really just as the way that you'll perform the ongoing operations in your new system, and configuring them, making the decisions about how to do that. I think of workflows as kind of qualitative, that there are principles and guidelines of how it works, but they generally will have judgment calls rather than just a set of clicks that you can easily do. So that's why there's decision making involved at all. To begin thinking about how you do that, it helps to break the work of the library into various categories. I put some general ones here with the understanding that a lot of that will be determined more by your organizational structure. Cataloging might be more or less integrated into the acquisitions process. E-resource processes could be more or less integrated into physical resource processing. Libraries will handle that differently. And so rather than kind of think of it as folio app by folio app, you'll want to think about how your library works and how the pieces fit together. And that's understanding that you need to bring rather than expect a vendor team to impose that. I think that's wouldn't be the goal generally. Then as far as understanding the current practices that you have, you've got several sources of data. Ideally, you'll have some written procedures. A lot of libraries have created flowcharts and maps around what their workflows are. I think either of those might have varying levels of updating needed, right? There's never a perfect system for that. But I think it is important to gather that up and to some degree understand where that's coming from and what the priorities are to maintain where possible. And then certainly there's always information just trapped in people's heads. And so as we talk about kind of pitfalls and risk management, that's certainly part of it is do we have a good way of extracting that? Do we have a good way of expressing that in a way that works to make these things concrete? Okay. So as we kind of move into that stage where you're making the decisions about folio workflows, it's pretty natural to ask, how is this done in folio? Show me the steps of doing it in folio. And sometimes there is a single way or a best practice, but in other cases you might need to apply quite a bit more creativity. There's this first category that I've got here there where it's less a decision about how to do things, and really more, are we going to bother doing this thing? And then also who will do it, how often, what triggers that, when does that happen? So some examples of that might be like your request queue and how you'll handle that. The choices around that really is how long is our hold shelf expiration period, things like that. But it's really, if we're going to do it, here's how we're going to do it. Check in and check out. There's not really a lot of options and decisions to make there. And then things like invoices. Are you going to use that in folio, or is that just going to be tracked separately? Something like receiving. Do you need to bother? Is it important to you to know that the thing that you've ordered has come in, or are you of a certain size or type of library? You say, we've ordered it, we'll figure it out later if we haven't gotten it. And then, do you need to add pieces prospectively there? Some smaller choices. You see that it's not as much discussion needs to happen around some of these. On the other hand, there's plenty of workflows with quite a bit more room for creativity, where often you might be frustrated with the answer that there's not a right way to do that in folio. As you learn in the community, there's not even consensus around how other libraries do it. And almost certainly it'll be different from how you used to do it in your old system. So really, it's just a matter of being ready for that. Some examples of that, circulation rules and the criteria that go into that. The locations hierarchy is a unique way of structuring it in folio, I think. Patron groups, material types, loan types. Again, coming from various systems, that can be a new way of thinking about things, where you really have some choices of what labels are we going to use on item records to group them for circulation purposes. Patron identifiers, 4 different fields in folio, kind of out of the box to identify patrons. And so it's sometimes just a matter of math. How many ways do you refer to your patrons with usernames and barcodes and IDs and prox cards and apps and things like that? And which fields do those need to land in? What are the reasonings around what external systems need to integrate and things like that? And then if needed, creating custom fields that could pretty easily be used in the checkout process as well. Mark to instance mapping, something that Heather briefly mentioned. kind of this concept of creating a representational record of your bibs and choices to make around especially local notes fields, local call number types, things like that, that you want to have available in that kind of brief record in Folio. Maybe a little more quickly, your import profiles for MARC records, the choices you're going to make about how to map things in for incoming records, your financial record structures. There's several layers in Folio for doing that, and you've got choices around fund types and fund groups and expense classes. And again, do you want to bring over things roughly the way that they were, or try something new? Order templates, and yeah, maybe just some other kind of custom pick lists and things like that. So in the process of configuring these workflows, the first thing that I'd identify as a pitfall is kind of the timing, but also the cycle of training that like we all understand. You need to grasp what Folio is and what it does enough to make informed decisions, which may mean a couple iterations with the data and those sample records like Heather mentioned, and understanding where you could be headed before you make a commitment there. But then there's the later process as you're preparing to go live, the more formal training of equipping your frontline staff for their workflows. That needs to be carefully planned and thought through, and ideally part of the implementation team will be among those helping to understand and were involved in creating the workflows and then kind of passing them on to the people doing them more regularly. Similar kind of issues with the implementation timeline in general. Definitely understanding the risks associated with last minute changes, last minute decisions. As you iterate with data loads, you'll want to have tried out some of those decisions to see what their implications would be, rather than finally deciding on something that's drastically different and not giving you time to test adequately before you get there. The local team dynamics, I think we all know that the people that know how to do the job the best aren't necessarily people that can explain how to do the job the best. I think there's that balance of who understands and who can explain, because they're people configuring settings that we'll get to next are often going to be different than the people that are going to be doing the frontline work. So what are the communication channels? What is the meeting cadence with your vendors? All of those things have an impact on how your workflows end up. Certainly any local politics, disputes about what is the right way of doing it and how willing the organization is to adapt to change really needs to be accounted for and handled locally. And last, I did want to point out the Folio development cycle. It's kind of a blessing and a curse that we've got 3 major releases on average per year, with those other ones in between. In general, you're not going to be forced to rethink a workflow. They're not going to take features away that you are counting on. But there is quite a strong possibility in some areas that something is coming that you might wish you knew about and were aware of. And it can be a challenge to know what's coming and to know how much to rely on the development timeline and what's likely to happen versus hoped for. So as a second related phase that I'll be talking about is the settings. Where the workflows are a little more fuzzy and qualitative and judgment calls, I think of the settings as more quantitative, that you have to decide, am I going to check this box or not? This list is going to have values populated. What are those values going to be? You want to connect to a Z3950 target. You need credentials in there and a place for that to go. Those kinds of things are settings. Definitely really iterative with workflows, right? If you're going to activate title level requests as a setting in Folio, then you've got to build workflows to handle that. So the trick is, part of the trick is just the volume of options to consider. I've got here kind of smashed onto a single page the 24 places to click in the settings app. It's pretty convenient that it's a single app, kind of relatively centralized and straightforward. But that's kind of a lot of places to go for things. One level beyond that, I've opened just an example, order settings, where you've got your list on the far right there of reasons for closing a purchase order. At that second level over of clicks, at least 145 settings. So this is the part where I just can't imagine self-implementing. Like I would really rely on a team like ours to say, okay, what do I need to know? Where should I start? What do I even click on here, right? And then certainly anybody that's been in these settings knows that some of them are much more complicated as well. If you go into the circulation settings to a loan policy, there's dozens of individual decisions with different ramifications for workflows and other things. Let's see. So, click here, hang on. And then this is an example of kind of some of the more technical, kind of more daunting settings to the circulation rules editor. If you haven't been there before, it looks like kind of computer code and where do you start with that? Plenty of other things like that, right? Staff permission sets that can nest into each other. There's 3 different calendars, at least 3 different like calendars in Folio, the calendar for your circulation due dates, one for fixed schedules like a semester length loan, and then the terms for your course reserve courses and the items in those. Kind of differentiating between those can be a challenge if you're getting started. And then something like inventory note types entails a certain level of understanding of that 3-level structure of Folio inventory records, instances, holdings, and items, and how they're related to each other. So with that, just kind of as a bit of backdrop, some of the pitfalls here, it can be overwhelming, and where do you start? Part of the where to start question is about the dependencies among things. I think there's some clear ways that it's kind of visible at a macro level. Like if you're going to migrate user records in, you really should decide first how you're going to use those patron identifier fields so that it has somewhere to go, so you can test it in a way that makes sense. So at the broad strokes, there's kind of an order of things. Before you can test your circulation settings, you're going to need each of the various criteria that you're going to use in your system, your locations or material types or patron groups and things like that. But then also at the more micro level, again, the loan policy that has those various options. If you were to go through that whole list of 140 some odd settings and try to make a little index for yourself of what is the decision we're going to make at that level, you might be frustrated because once you've gone in there once and created a long-term loan, you go in the next time and create a short-term loan, different settings appear. And so that's one of the things to be careful of, is not expect things to be exactly the same each time you iterate through something, depending on the settings area. A lot of that does depend on what else you did elsewhere. Similar to what Heather mentioned with access to your existing records, the ability to get records out, the importance of having multiple people in case a key person takes another job in the middle of things and nobody else has access to the system at all, that can really slow things down. But similarly for just settings in general, to understand in the legacy system which settings mattered in relation to which workflows, that sometimes they're interconnected, and to be able to bring the right people into those conversations can be important. And then with that growing understanding of Folio, which settings remain relevant, right? We defined our locations in a certain way in the old system, and there were reasons for that. Oh, I see that because of the loan type option in Folio, maybe that one isn't as relevant. So people that have access to those kind of prior settings, and also enough understanding around where to head with them next. And then again, with that contrast with workflows that are a little more flexible, some of that can kind of settle over time with workflows, that you can try it and then realize, okay, the steps need to be in a different order, but the system's kind of there. Generally less flexibility with settings. Some you can activate and deactivate and kind of deal with, but in other cases, it's really a more concrete choice that really needs to be made at a certain point. So important question is really who has the authority to make those decisions, and as Brooks will get into, are the right people on the team to work that way, and just realizing how many things have implications across the different areas of workflows and settings, especially in those cases. Are the right people in the room to say with certainty what the setting should be.
And just to sort of piggyback on what Robert was saying, it is really important to understand that you're going to have to make a lot of decisions, and you're going to have to do that fairly quickly. That decision paralysis can just be deadly, especially if you only have X number of months before you need to go live on FOLIO. So I'm just going to talk briefly about integrations. There are so many possibilities here, and I think the most important factor is to prioritize these. Consider what can be done and what can't be done. If something cannot be done, are you able to help that be accomplished? Are you able to help with that development? We have a couple of examples here: SSO, discovery. My favorite part, integrating with cataloging and OCLC, interlibrary loan, remote storage. And it's important to sort of list these out at the beginning of a project and prioritize them. There's going to be different integrations for different libraries that are going to be sort of do or die. And your implementation team really needs to know what those are up front, so that we can help you accomplish that. Another consideration that Brooks will get into is, do you have the staffing to make all of your integrations work? And is it something that you have to have done by go live? Because there are some things that can be a little bit squishier that can, come up a little bit after go live. I can think of one example in particular with invoices and being able to integrate that with campus systems. So, consider what is most important to not only your staff, but also your users. Of course, another great resource is going to be other libraries that have implemented FOLIO. So talk to them, find out what they've had luck with, what they haven't had luck with, what the pain points were with each of these integrations, and educate yourself and your staff on really the incredible flexibility, but also some of the limitations of FOLIO. So again, pitfalls. Is there another vendor that is going to be involved with your integrations? And are they going to be on board with helping you and us create those integrations that work successfully? Usually those sorts of talks have to start very early on in the process to make sure that it can be done in time. Sometimes, we all let things slip through the cracks, and are you able to communicate effectively with that third-party vendor in order to get the data that you need in order to set up your integrations? And again, lack of staffing bandwidth. You're not going to always have the right people at the right time working on your project. I mean, that's ultimately the goal, is to have that, but you need to really sort of prepare for needing more people to become involved and sort of put out any fires that might arise, and always have backup. As Robert mentioned, always having somebody else who's able to get the data out of your legacy system, having, another set of eyes on things is really important. So, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to talk about assembling your local implementation team and what that looks like, and how to assemble one that's going to give you the best opportunity to succeed. Kind of some general considerations to think about whenever you're deciding who to place on this team. Are you working with a vendor that provides implementation services for your chat? Popped up there. What kind of timeline are you working with? So if you've got a 5-year lead time on your project, you can take a lot of time to make decisions, and you can go through a lot of data iterations, and you can really kind of dig in and get really deep in the weeds on things. But if you need to implement in 3 months, you're going to need to be lean and mean in your implementation. You're going to have to be able to have a team that can make decisions quickly and respond to changes that need to be made in the data quickly. How did your library select Folio to replace your existing system? Who was involved in that process? How did you put together the RFP? How did you put together your list of requirements that the vendors were responding to? Who on your staff could you spare from general operations for a handful of hours a week or more, depending on what their role in the team is? What is the overall level of interest in the project among your staff? Is this something that the rank and file just could care less about, or that they're incensed about, or they just are ambivalent about? Brings us to kind of what are some roles that you're going to look to fill on your local implementation team. Kind of the first one to think about is, who will the project lead be? So this is the person on your local team that organizes the aspects of the project from the side of your library. So they're the person that makes contact with people, potentially finds other people to be on the implementation team, seeks out expert advice from frontline staff on questions of workflows and things like that. This would be, if you're working with a vendor or not, this is the primary point of contact for the project, both from the vendor side and from your library staff side. It's very helpful, and I speak to this from experience. It's helpful if this person was also involved in the selection of Folio as your solution. That gives them context and allows them to speak to how Folio met the requirements that your selection group came up with. For self-implementing organizations, this is probably a full-time job. This is whether or not it's the only job the person has is a completely other story, but it is a full-time job. The next role you probably want to look at filling is the technical lead. This is the person that manages the systems aspects of the project. They coordinate the extraction of data from existing systems. If you're self-implementing, they're probably the ones that are coordinating loading of that data into Folio and how you're accomplishing that. They're the ones that are probably coordinating most of the third-party integrations that require some kind of technical expertise. They're the ones that are coordinating with your local IT groups. It's also helpful if this person was involved in selecting Folio. Again, coming from experience. For self-implementing libraries, this is also probably a full-time job, but it can also be the same person as the project lead, in which case it is definitely a full-time job regardless of whether you are self-implementing or not. I also say this from personal experience. I was the project lead and the technical lead for Missouri State's implementation back in 2020, and it was definitely a full-time job, and it was definitely not my only job. The next roles you want to look at are the functional area leads. So you want to have representation from every operational area of your library, regardless of whether or not they interact with the ILS on a normal basis. You don't want to get to the end of your project and realize you've made decisions that are hampering the ability of your research and instructional services librarians to provide the services they need to provide to your patrons. These people do not need to be the heads of their areas. In fact, it is probably a good idea if they're not. You want some rank and file and frontline representation in this process especially if you're dealing with situations where you have a lot of institutional implicit knowledge in the heads of long-serving staff. You want to bring them into this process. The key consideration with these folks is engagement. You want to find people who are going to be engaged, whether they are enthusiastic about the project. It's helpful if they are, but it is not required as long as they are engaged. Administration. Sometimes I hear stories that administration selected this product for us to implement, dropped it in our laps, and walked away. Some cases, literally, they made the decision and then went on to another job. But what you want to have is the library administration involved early and often in the project. Ideally, they're part of the implementation project team in some capacity. They may not meet with the team every time they meet, but they do meet with them regularly. Implementing FOLIO, as Robert and Heather mentioned, will probably involve changes to your local policies and procedures that will need administrative approval. Bringing those to their attention as early as possible is usually a good idea, because for some of those decisions, like fees and fines, you will probably have to seek approval from groups beyond your administration. Sorry, getting a little dry in the throat. Administration can also help provide context for the decision to implement FOLIO and really, really express the overall goals of the project. When Missouri State implemented, the dean of the libraries there was very enthusiastic, and every meeting that we were in with him, he told us, do what you need to do to get this implemented, do what you need to do to bring us live, and we'll make that happen. And that was both reassuring and inspiring, I think, to the project team that we were working with. And again, that can help drive the engagement level of your staff and even probably induce some enthusiasm in people who may not be initially open to the project. IT, as we mentioned, if your library is part of a larger organization, a university, a government, a business, you're going to have to work with IT to implement FOLIO, full stop. Some examples of things you're going to have to coordinate with them are SSO, if you want to use SSO, sending emails from FOLIO with a custom domain, ongoing patron data loads. I definitely recommend addressing this one very early with your IT. Lots of organizations will wait to the last minute to do this, and it always does not go well. It's helpful, I think, to engage IT early on all of these topics. And I even think it's a good idea to invite them to be part of your project team. Ask them to be representative to your meetings, or at least have someone who sits in on them occasionally whenever you're going to be talking about IT-related parts of the project. Don't make them an afterthought. Don't make them a secondary participant in your project. Make them a first-class participant. On assembling your team, some of the pitfalls you might run into, and this is a common refrain in all of the pitfalls I think we've mentioned, not enough time. The length of your implementation project can really have a direct impact on your ability to have a large implementation project team or a small implementation project team. If you need to be quick, a large team is just going to slow you down. It is likely to lead to you missing your targets for implementation, or rushing at the last minute to make decisions you're maybe not going to be happy with in the long run. The lack of availability from IT is also a major problem that you might encounter. If you don't have a good institutional relationship with your IT group, begin to cultivate one now. If that means hiring someone onto your team that has a good relationship with your institution's IT, do that. The next thing would be a lack of engagement, like I mentioned earlier, from the various leads, whether it's the functional leads or the project lead or the tech lead, or even your IT participant in the process. A lack of engagement from administration is a definite red flag, and something you want to try and avoid. And a lack of engagement for the functional areas, whether it's from the folks who are on the team actively or the other people that you bring in for advice. If you need to go to someone in the frontline staff for advice about a workflow, but they're not interested in participating in the project, that's going to be a problem for you. Basically kind of wrapping up to what I was going to be saying, but for me, the bottom line with putting together a team for an implementation project like this is empowering them to make decisions about the data and about the implementations, the policies that are going to be reflected in FOLIO. Whether they have final say on what those could be or not is something you can put up in the air, but you want them to feel like they have that power, and it should be real. If you're an administrator looking to bring a team like this together and you have the option to give them the ability to make decisions in certain areas about certain types of policies, tell them that up front and be open to those policy recommendations from the group, because nothing can slow a project down like getting bogged down in an administrative decision that you probably could have made at the beginning if you'd had an open conversation about it from the start. That brings us to questions. Anybody have anything they want to ask? Raise your hand, we'll bring you a mic.
Do you have any recommendations or comments about organizational change management?
Either of you want to take this, or?
Where do we begin with this? I think be prepared for people to not be happy all the time. And it's a dance, it's a delicate balance. But I think that empowering people really helps, and giving people the power to make decisions really creates a sense of unity among project teams. I also think acknowledging that this is a different system, it's going to be different, there's going to be change, and I think a lot of it will be for the best, and there will always be things that you're going to miss from that system. Even if you don't think you're going to, there will be something that you miss in your legacy system. I also love the example when Anya was bringing Massey University live. They actually held a wake for their legacy system and lit candles and bid it a fond farewell. And, I think that being able to sort of let go of the baggage of your old system and be able to start fresh, it's really imperative and not always easy. And we try to help with that as much as we can.
One other thing our colleague Anya emphasizes is kind of that distinction between strategy and tactics, and where you can afford to be a little unclear. I think, there's no end to questions about tactics, the details of how you're going to make decisions and how things are going to work. But I think you really can't afford a lack of clarity around the strategy, and that can shortcut a lot of those other concerns. And I mean, sometimes the answer is frustrating, that we are making this decision because it was cheaper to do this. Therefore, we've got to get in line and just figure it out. Or our contract's ending, so we've only got 6 months. We wish we had a couple more years, but like this is the reason why it's so rushed. We're ending the contract. Maybe you weren't aware of that, whatever. And that invites the right level of engagement with the process. Say, okay, well, I don't like it, but I understand. We'll deal with the details as they come.
Yeah, that's where I think pardon what I was saying earlier about having people involved in the implementation project team on the library side who were involved in the decision to select Folio, or just like, I mean, honestly, to select any system you're going to be implementing. If the people selecting it don't have any skin in the game of implementing it, it can be really discouraging, and it can make folks feel like they're just being put upon. And I think avoiding that is critical to managing the changes that you're going to be bringing about with this project.
Just for the benefit of those here in person, I do want to acknowledge the chat from Molly that a good point about notifying third-party vendors when you're making that change and early. A good example is letting vendors who do Edifact invoicing know about system changes, since they may need to adjust file outputs, right? We don't often think about some of those things that are so ingrained in how we've done things that maybe it's setting up a different FTP load or other things like that.
Does anyone else have a question? Is anyone thinking about the reception this evening?
We are curious who's here. So there's maybe those currently in the process of adopting, those considering adopting, those already using Folio, and then call kind of all the others like us. So who here is in the process of adopting Folio and migrating to it? We've got a few there. Who's considering Folio? Okay. And then who's already a Folio user and just here to kick themselves for how it went. Okay. So I mean, I do think that lends themselves to different kind of conversation that we could have here too, right? Those of you using Folio, do you relate to these kind of challenges that we've seen, or did you have different ones? Is there any advice that you would give that we didn't? Anything come to mind along those lines?
Hi, Jason Root, Texas A&M. We went January of 2022, and I will have to say the part about the getting the stakeholders involved and getting people aware of what's happening far before you start spinning up anything or having anyone else spin stuff up for you was very important for us. I mean, we got on board with the project in like, I don't know, 2015 or something like that, and it's been a long haul to get there. But stakeholder involvement, and for us, one of the big helps that we had was I work for the library. I'm on their IT team. I helped manage the infrastructure and getting things moving with, getting data out of the old system into the new system. We have our own developer team also that we work hand in hand with. And so for us, what really helped that process flow was just that immediate feedback, that immediate communication, the data migration, iteration over iteration over iteration. We did that same methodology. I have destroyed and stood up thousands of Folio databases in the process of, it only has to work once, right? It just has to work one time and then we're there. But getting to that point where it does work consistently, that one time where it really matters, took a lot of energy and effort. And we spent years doing that. So yeah, if I had one piece of advice, yeah, that's it. Do it frequently, do it often, get comfortable with it. Then you have a shot.
Thanks for sharing that, Jason. From my experience at an academic library, one of the things that I can relate to from that is that middle management or people at the top maybe have been talking about migration or whatever it is for months. It seems like every week there's a new meeting about it. And so there's this sort of saturation that it feels like we've been talking about this for a year, where somebody at the front line is like, I have never heard about this, right? I have never been in that room for that conversation. And so it is a matter of being deliberate about when people get brought in, which issues are worth raising at which time. And it's hard, right? If we knew how to do it, we'd just do it. But recognizing it's the first step.
Thanks. So a question maybe also to those who are using Folio already. So LMU in Munich, and we're starting our plan, we're right at the beginning. But I'm already thinking, so also looking, the implementation team, the wider number of people who are involved. But I'm already thinking after the implementation, the regular updates. And my first gut feeling is that even though it might not be the same kind of scope, we're still going to need representatives of every area to go and review the small in number decisions that arise with every update. And so I'm wondering if there's experience, like it feels like keep the same project team, maybe smaller because it doesn't have to be as big, but is there any like experience? I see hands up from Jason, thank you. If any, I don't know, any experience to share, or is it worth maybe having different people because the implementation was so hard that you need new fresh blood for other decisions? I don't know.
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit. That was the approach we took at Missouri State. It kind of became second nature to a lot of the process, and it's gotten a lot better in terms of the stability of the product. And there aren't dramatic changes from update to update as there used to be in the past, where you really need to kind of get in there and look at things because something might have gone horribly wrong during a database migration. But yeah, that was kind of the approach that we took there, and I think it served pretty well.
There we go. All right. Yeah. Same comments. A lot of the people that were involved in our initial migration still work at the library. They still know what they're doing. Now they know how to do it in Folio. So that learning curve is a lot less of a hump to get over to, hey, does this data look okay? Does your workflow work okay? Okay, I know what my workflow is. Let me go do it. Yeah, it still works the same, or no, something's changed. What's going on? And likewise, the ease of maintaining the system has gotten better over the years since we've, adopted it. We were an early adopter. We had a lot of time to kind of figure that out. And the project had some time also to figure that out. And so that has helped greatly. The 3 releases a year thing is still daunting. Not too long ago it was 4 releases a year. And now we're always more or less a version behind, right? Like I like to think of the last version as stable, and the newest version works, but maybe not best. And so for us, updating 3 times a year is just not tenable. There's only one of me, and it takes a lot of energy coordinating all of that with all of the subject matter experts and librarians and IT staff and developers. So we tend to do it on downtimes, usually over the Christmas break or over the summer. So
yeah, and another consideration here is that as the frontline staff become more and more familiar with Folio and using it for their day-to-day workflows, they're going to become the people who smoke test things. I mean, because they're going to log in that first day after an upgrade, and the first time they try to do something and it fails, they're going to know something's wrong and they're going to reach out to you.
I appreciate Julie bringing that up. Our job is implementation consultant, not maintenance consultants. And so it's easy for us to get, stop at the point where, okay, you're on your own now. But we love being part of this broader community to talk about how do we make that transition better. I think that's a great point.
I just wanted to draw attention to the chat. Chuck Kuntz, Chuck, is echoing Brooks's comment about involving IT early and setting up the user load early. We started dev on the user load in May, and we were still tweaking it last week. So another thing to keep in mind, though, is that you have this community of people who you can tap, regardless of whether or not you are, using EBSCO or self-hosting. Like, we're all in this boat together to help each other. And I think it's really important to, even after implementation ends, you're not really alone. Like, we're not going to abandon you. People are still going to be able to help you and support you in whatever way you need. And I just love the open source community for that. So that's all.
a dramatic difference from having a forum to post on that your question may or may not get answered, and you may or not be able to ever be able to find that question again, versus having something like Slack where you can go in and ask a question and you will probably get an answer within a few minutes, or depending on time zones, maybe a few hours. I know the folks like our colleague Masami and some of the folks she supports, it can be a few hours before they get a response because everyone that can answer the question is asleep, or vice versa.
Well, there's some other comments there, but
I think we got everything.
I'm curious, those planning to implement or in the earlier stages, anything that you're most concerned about, whether you came with that concern or it came to you during our time here?
I was trying to figure out how to ask this question. As someone who's in the early-ish stages of trying to implement, I guess we're halfway through, and is wishing that I had seen this presentation a year ago, and is feeling like I fell into some pits already. Wondering if people have experience or advice about how to reset. I think probably the biggest pitfall for us was underestimating the level of effort and under resourcing. And this is such a beautiful deck of all the things we needed to do a year ago. So I don't know if anyone else has been in my shoes before, and how you kind of acknowledge that, reset, and got back on track.
So at the very beginning, we had 3 beta libraries, and Chalmers went first, right? But we also had 5 colleges who did a lot for their implementation and then realized they needed more time and kind of stopped a little bit. And we're still engaged and very much involved in the community, but they did an extension on their current contract, and then they continued on until FOLIO, until, because their concerns were more functional concerns. So they waited until FOLIO got there. So they had that time built in and adjusted for that. So I think being open to adjusting is good.
Seems like there's room for more than that, right? Yeah, I think that's a good start, though, right? That we've announced our timelines and we've signed a contract and that kind of thing. But I think a lot of examples of institutions that stop and say, okay, now that we know where we are, what really needs to happen by that date? So I do think that could be part of the answer in some cases. What else about getting out of a hole once we're in there?
I mean, part of it is attempting to recognize what you can do. I mean, if you are really tied in, to that date, what does it? Maybe it's reconceptualizing what a successful implementation looks like. What is the absolute, honest to goodness, we have to have it working by this date functionality that's in the system. If you're dealing with a fiscal, like you need to implement on a fiscal year start, maybe the only thing you go live with is acquisitions. And you find some way to make that work with your cataloging workflows. If you need circulation active by this time, because you lose access to your system, but you can maybe do some of your other functions, and this probably it doesn't apply to you all, but kind of it's a general thing. You get inventory and circulation working, and you deal with acquisitions later. ERM, kind of the same way. If you don't have any, if you had planned on being live with ERM the same time you're live with the rest of the system, and ERM is something you're perfectly happy right now dealing with in spreadsheets, or you have another system you can keep running to do with that for a little while, you wait and focus on the things that are most mission critical to have in place on day one.
Julie's back.
Yeah, and just a comment from my experience outside of Folio beforehand, but you said like reset, and I think it's so one step back. I think, you know, when you do project plans, it's easy, you think, you know, and from a nearly waterfall, like you have your kickoff and then you have your phases, and you may have like your gateways between your phases and everything. But I think it's also okay, especially in IT projects where it is easier to iterate. If you feel you need to like say, as you said, reset. So we stop now, and nearly like you artificially start the project again. And it's like, okay, we're going to start with the planning, you know, even the vision and the planning and what resources we have and what our goals, the goals may have changed because the timeline has changed, etc. And you nearly start your project again. Like I mean, I don't know, you don't need the authorization from me, but you're allowed to do that, right? If you feel that you need to do that, right? Because that's at least the good thing versus, you know, building a new building, right? And where it's like we've done 3 floors and we realize it's not going to work for us. You can, I think, reset a bit easier with such projects here. What is what?
That makes me think again about my experience at an academic library that, you know, you might spend hundreds of hours collectively coming up with a strategic plan for the next 5 years, and stuff happens and you need to reset. The worst outcome, I think, is to just never discuss the plan again and say, oh, well, what happened with it? I don't know. I guess they didn't. I don't know. It doesn't feel great to say, hey, we had these goals and we didn't meet them. But that's so valuable to say, here's what happened. We lost key staff. Let's talk about how we've dealt with that, and let's celebrate what we've done, you know, in the meantime. Like we have accomplished some things, including learning enough about Folio to know the scope of what we're up against. So I do think something about, being official and deliberate about that reset and saying, here we are, this is our new starting point, and define it a little bit.
I mean, and acknowledging this is hard. I mean, most organizations do this kind of thing once every decade, 2 decades, 3 decades for some institutions or more. It's not something that you can really have good institutional knowledge about, like you're just not going to have the expertise in house to do this. I mean, that's one of the reasons that for some organizations it makes sense to go with a vendor to provide assistance here. And sometimes it's just a big project, and all big projects never. It's that whole no plan survives first contact with the enemy. I mean, the enemy is time, because in this case you're never going to have enough time. You're never going to have as much time as you want. And learning that sooner rather than later is great, because if you realize you don't have enough time, after you can't get a contract extension on your old system anymore because you missed the deadline for that and you're out, and you have to jump when you have to jump, that's bad. And when you have options, that's much better. Bad news does not get better with time. Yep.
We're happy to discuss further, but we're also happy to wrap up if
A little after
you're ready to go.
4:30. So, any other questions, comments, advice?
Go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I think if you implement this folio, you have to, the communication is really the key. The communication not is like your institute with the folio consultant, but also communication with your own staff your own implementation team in your institute. From my own experience, for instance, the FOLIO consultant, they have an agenda according to your timeline, whether you will do that within 6 months or a year and a half, they have agenda. So you basically, for me, basically follow their agenda. They done this before and they know what to do first, what's the second. So basically I will follow that, but you know your institution better and your workflows. So you need also working with them. Sometimes the agenda could be changed a little bit. Something you have to come first, or so the communication with them is really, really key. And you may meet once a week with your consultant, but you might need a higher level meeting besides to this weekly meeting. And for your for instance, they said you have technical needs, you have functional needs, you might have project leader. Those could be 3 person or could be just 1 person. And this key person need have very good communication with your consultant and with your own team. You really need, as Brooks mentioned, you need to empower them. So for instance, circulation rules, your SEC staff, they know exactly the workflows. So they need to write out every scenario. Then the technical needs know how to write the rules according to the written workflows. So I feel like that also you need with your IT department, with the third outside vendor, for instance, we have MeScan, everything you have to start very early, like the patron knows, and with your IT, if you use Okta, you need working with the key person. Also, you also need to involve them in certain meetings because that's very technical. For me, I don't know what they are doing, but I know you have to know to put those people together. So get things done. You don't that as a need. You don't need to know everything, but you have to know who is the one do the job. So that's just start any involve IT. For instance, for our invoice with our local financial integration financial system for the payment is really we don't need the end, but even we go live in May, we still have things to tweak. And Brooks this morning even get an email. And as they said, they don't abandon us. Even when we went live, they're still helping us. I think the one thing I feel like people often talk about vendor and client information relationship. I really feel like we should be the partner. They'll be a part of your FOLIO in implementation. Make them partner. That's actually the FOLIO embraced is a community. So I really feel very lucky. Heather and Brooks is our consultant, and they just help us. I cannot say enough how much they're helping us. Just I don't want to go into detail, but I feel really lucky. And in general, the migration is a success for us, and our staff actually embrace this new system. They're pretty happy. Thank you.
Thank you, Yan.
Thank you, Yan.
There is another comment here from Chuck at Biola that they've talked about who needs to see success first, their users or their staff. And so they chose to configure circulation and test that heavily, discovery, getting things mapped into their instance there, knowing that staff would continue to struggle and chip away at some of the things with acquisitions in ERM and things like that. Great way of putting that. We're very happy to continue talking. If anybody has, wants to follow up with us, if we didn't do it already, we will get slides posted into the schedule as well. So you'll have access to that. But thanks so much for this conversation and for being here.
Thank you, everyone.